So there's this part at the end of Return to Quag Keep by Andre Norton and Gene Rabe, where the kids are dumped back out of the fantasy world that they've been escorted to, and they find themselves in Lake Geneva. And they have the following conversation. Lake Geneva. Why Wisconsin? Why not Brooklyn? Why not Kentucky or Australia? Why Wisconsin? I don't know. I think that's because there's still magic here. It was the brightest spot of Jalafar Rula's globe. The magic that's left on Earth is strongest here. Welcome to Spot Check. So this week is GaryCon, and I am decidedly not in Lake Geneva, where the magic that's left on Earth is strongest. And it's been kind of difficult. This is the first GaryCon I've missed since I started doing my field work there. And I've just been sitting watching all the photos and posts pour in from all of the people attending. And so I thought I would do a spot check today, talking a little bit more about GaryCon and some of my experiences there. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the experience at Center Street, the house where Gary lived when he wrote Dungeons & Dragons. And so I'll get started on that in a minute, but just a quick update on what I've been working on dissertation-wise. I've been transcribing audio from a game session I played in New York, the first game session I played when I got to New York, actually. It was session 200 of the Glantry campaign, which is a campaign that's part of New York Red Box, an organization put together by James Nostack and some others. And so in this chapter, talking about New York and Connecticut, I'm talking about how games change over long periods of time. That Glantry session was number 200. The session in Connecticut has gone on for well over a decade. And so thinking about how our experience of game worlds changes over long periods of time and how that interacts with the different relationships we have with each other. So that's what I've been working on as far as transcription goes, and I'll have more to say about that in the future. But for now, I wanted to talk about Center Street. While few GaryCon attendees would claim that their journey to Lake Geneva brings them closer to the divine, Geek Preacher being a notable exception, there is still a touch of religious awe in the way that we interact with the legendary artifacts and sites of the convention. Besides the Table of Honor, the convention also features a small exhibit of Gary and Dave's personal effects, including their briefcases and the typewriter Gary used in the typing of the first version of D&D. Two men, Paul Stormberg and Kevin Maurice, take on the task of serving as the artifact's curators. To call someone a curator is to place them only a step removed from the more religious term curate, and Paul and Kevin's role often seems to be a hybrid of both. Paul's side-parted hair and clean-shaven face contrast with Kevin's Gandalf-style beard and long gray hair, such that standing back-to-back they create a sort of Janus-like figure that encompasses the entire spectrum of the white male gamer appearance. Each year, Paul and Kevin also bring a sand table, modeled on Gary's description of his own table, in much the same way that someone might create a replica of the Ark of the Covenant using the original measurements from Deuteronomy. Even the miniature figures at the table were made following Gary's original modifications of non-fantastic figures into an army of orcs led by the giant king Verdermere. The zenith of these recreationist endeavors came during the final convention of my fieldwork, when the organizers obtained permission to set up the sand table in the basement of Lake Geneva House, where Gary lived when he first wrote D&D. The little white story at 330 Center Street sits on a center lot just 1 block from the Horticultural Hall, site of the first Gen Con. Although Luca, who I met in my first GaryCon, had pointed out the house to me on my first visit to Lake Geneva, at the time no one had contacted the current owners, who use it as a vacation home, to explain the significance of the location, and we contented ourselves with gazing thoughtfully at the structure from the street. Thus it was with some excitement that I stepped out onto the porch in 2014. Finding the front door locked, I followed the characteristic sound of laughing gamers around to the side of the house and heaved open the cellar door. Descending the stone steps, we knocked tentatively at the interior wooden door, which still bears an inscription in Gary's hand. Entrance. Wargames room. Paul greeted us warmly, ushering us into a typically unfurnished Midwestern basement, complete with a cold concrete floor and exposed metal support poles. A small collection of gamers huddled over the sand table to our right. Among them were Mark Clover, the unofficial photographer of Gary Con, whose pictures appear in the chapter that I'm writing about this, and Terry Kuntz, who had attended enough of Gary's original basement games to help Paul recreate the original layout. Kevin and Paul had labored long into the night, getting everything just right, even mounting shelves for the miniatures in the exact location that Gary had done the same. The table, Paul explained almost apologetically, was a few inches too close to the far wall in order to shift it away from one of the support beams. The basement game was more than simply a historical recreation, however. Mark, Terry, and the others at the table were reenacting one of the oldest archetypal images of gaming, one exemplified by Tavis Allison's interpretation of the lyrics, "The way we used to argue, locked in your basement." In my 8 years of researching role-playing games, this visit to Center Street was the only time I ever actually observed gamers playing in a basement. Despite this, the basement endures as the prototypical location for gaming, to the extent that when journalist Ethan Gilsdorf reported on the Center Street game, he called that basement the original geek lair and confided that, yes, the stereotype of a nerd gamer in the basement has a basis in reality. In puzzling over the persistence of this image, I cannot shake the parallels with Jung's famous dream of exploring a house. And he says, in the dream, "I came upon a heavy door and opened it. Beyond it, I discovered layers of brick among ordinary stone blocks and chips of brick in the mortar. As soon as I saw this, I knew that the walls dated from Roman times. My interest was by now intense. I looked more closely at the floor. It was of stone slabs, and in one of these I discovered a ring. When I pulled it, the stone slab lifted, and I again saw a stairway of narrow stone steps leading down into the depths. These, too, I descended, and entered a low cave cut into the rock. Thick dust lay on the floor, and in the dust were scattered bones and broken pottery, like the remains of a primitive culture. I discovered 2 broken skulls, obviously very old and half disintegrated. Then I awoke." Around and back home again, thinking about gaming seems inevitably to lead me back to mythical analysis. This territory can be difficult to tread with scholarly detachment, and instead I find myself reimagining the origin story for D&D as a folk tale. It begins, like so many of the European folk tales that influence the game, with a cobbler. Once upon a time, there was a cobbler. This cobbler came from a long line of people known throughout the world for their ability to take the chaos of the universe and order it using rules and numbers, shaping it into a world controllable by humans. There were many problems with this, however, not the least of which was that chaos was magical, and the more they tamed the world, the less magical it became. One of the rules that the cobbler's people had developed meant that everyone must prove themselves useful at making numbers go up in order to be respected. It was this rule that left the cobbler spending many hours each day fixing people's shoes in his cold basement. One day, as he worked, the cobbler heard a noise. This in itself was not particularly notable. He heard noises quite often. This noise, however, was different for 2 reasons. First, it was echoing up from somewhere underneath the basement, where he had thought only some very unuseful dirt was located. Second, it was the roaring of a dragon, and none of his people had heard a real dragon in quite some time. Curious, the cobbler set down the shoe he had been hammering and slowly walked around his basement, trying to find out the source of the noise. Just as he began to get closer, however, his wife's voice rang out from upstairs announcing the arrival of a customer. He returned to his workbench, grabbed the pair of shoes he had repaired for the customer, and took them upstairs. But when he returned, the sound had gone. Confused, the cobbler went back to hammering and worked late into the night. The next day, as he descended the stairs to begin his work, he heard the noise again. Excitedly, he searched every inch of his basement. Surely there must be a door, or perhaps a loose slab that he had previously missed, but one that led down to the source of this not very useful but quite magical noise. All day he searched, and by evening he had found neither a door nor had he repaired any shoes. Dejected, the cobbler went back upstairs and slept very restlessly. As he slept, he dreamed about the days before he had become a cobbler, when he had used numbers in the ways of his people in order to find out the exact day on which they would die. In his dream, however, he was not using his numbers alone at a desk like he had before, but together in his basement with a jolly man dressed as an admiral in the Navy who was busily covering the gray stone of the basement in brown paint. Something else was strange in his dream. Every time he used the numbers to find out when someone would die, he heard the grating noise of stone grinding against stone. After a while of this, the admiral grabbed the cobbler's head and turned it toward the noise. The cobbler was surprised to find that a large cave entrance had opened in his basement, leading down into shadow. From out of the shadow he heard the roar of the dragon, and at this he awoke and knew how to find his way down out of the basement. I imagine such a tale being spun around a campfire in the last days of humanity, described by Jack Vance in his Dying Earth stories. Perhaps a learned wizard such as Rhialto the Marvelous might puzzle over the meaning of the story, whose euhemeristic origin was lost over the long eras of the sun's slow death. If Rhialto were to contact me through arcane temporal manipulation, I might explain it to him like this. My dearest Rhialto, thank you for taking the time to contact me regarding the tale of the Cobbler. I'm both delighted and surprised to learn that it has endured through the many years that stand between my time and yours, especially because I myself invented it in the process of composing a scholarly text. Of course, I do not suspect that my original survives in your age, though for a more expanded exposition of the text you might consider making a visit to the fabled Museum of Man in order to determine if the esteemed and all-knowing curator might possess a copy of my dissertation, The Greatest on Reality. As you suspect, the tale does have a less fanciful, though I assure you no less magical, historical origin. The main character in the story is E. Gary Gygax, who was at one time a cobbler, and before that pursued a vocation as what we call an insurance adjuster. His people, the Europeans, or more precisely the Swiss, pursued a philosophy known as modernity, for what you would no doubt consider a short span of time. Modernity was a complex phenomenon, and for details you might ask the curator to reference works by Max Weber, Anthony Giddens, Arjun Appadurai, and Zygmunt Bauman. The second of these scholars described the phenomenon as tripartite. One, a certain set of attitudes towards the world, the idea of the world as open to transformation by human intervention. Two, a complex of economic institutions, especially industrial production and a market economy. Three, a certain range of political institutions, including the nation-state and mass democracy. The taming of chaos in the story refers to the first of these, the making numbers go up, to the second, and the complex rules to the third. Many scholars in my time discussed the problems inherent in such pursuits, but that difficulty most relevant to the tale is what Weber referred to as disenchantment, in which, quote, technical means and calculations performed the services previously provided through mysterious magic powers. My limited understanding of your own powers leads me to suspect that they are a much more exalted version of this process. The second missing piece to your puzzle involves the significance of the basement and the cave beneath it. They are not, as you speculate, evidence that my time possessed the secrets of spawning creatures in subterranean vats. Instead, they reference the work of one Jung the Mystic. Jung taught that stories, dreams, and the imagination draw on not only the individual conscious mind, but the collective unconscious shared by all of humanity. Interpreting one of his own dreams, he believed that a basement served as an image of the individual unconscious, and that a cave beneath it served as an image of the collective unconscious. Whatever the validity of Jung's claims, of which you in your position at the end of time are more qualified to speak than I, the simple fact of his having made them has shaped the symbol of the basement in my time. This symbolism, in turn, seems to have shaped the perception of those who enjoyed a game created by Gary and Dave, the naval admiral in the dream. Through the game, players used the, quote, technical means and calculations of modernity to visit other worlds, ones that had not suffered the modernity's disenchantment. The centrality of the imagination in this game leads to an association with the collective unconscious of myth, which may explain why in my time they are often portrayed as playing in basements, even though this was often not the case. But I suspect that last point to be of little interest to you. Sincerely, Nicholas J. Miser.
That's why when we say you pay, you got to pay to